This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
Welcome. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Clay Ferraro here. Ira Winderman in Philadelphia. And Ira, let's get this out of the way right off the top, because I've always wanted to host a show when we can talk about the city of Philadelphia, because I need your take on this. Scale of 1 to 10. How overrated are Pats and Genos?
Well, you know what? It's not overrated as a tourist experience. To go there, to see them on opposite corners, to go over and have one in one and one in the other. I totally get it. I think it's like a lot of places. It's not the food, it's the experience. First of all, this whole cheese whiz thing, with or without or whatever. No. I mean, as you know, you get a good cheesesteak, you got some nice provolone, you got some stuff that actually looks like cheese that at some point might have come from an actual cow. That's the difference. This whole cheese whiz thing to me, it's like if you went anywhere and they ask you what kind of cheese you want on that. You're getting a burger, or you're getting a chicken sandwich or whatever, and they offer you Swiss or American or cheddar or provolone. You're not saying, nah, just give me a couple of shots of cheese whiz on that. So I think it's all overrated. But I do think you do it. I think it's like any other place. You go there as part of the experience. You go to the original Starbucks in Seattle as part of the experience, but you don't say to yourself, this is the best Starbucks I ever had in my life. You just do it. So I think the whole thing there is more of the experience, that they're on opposite corners. You take a trip, you sort of put it on your bucket list. You check it off. The food itself, it's, first of all, cheesesteaks, you have to say to yourself, I'm prepared to eat a greasy piece of not the highest quality meat on a pretty good hoagie roll or whatever they call it down here. But the whole cheese whiz thing, I will never go for that. There's probably not a single food item you can tell me, hey, wouldn't that be better with cheese whiz? I'm still waiting for that.
It's funny. You've got. I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent, but the cheese whiz or no cheese whiz is quite a debate. Yeah, if you're going to Philly, and we're going to get off of this after this statement. If you're going to Philly, you're right. Do the experience. Go, because you want to see like the two dueling Philly cheesesteak stands.
Corners right next to each other, yeah.
Get a small at one, get a small at the other, have one bite of each, and then throw them away and go to Reading Terminal Market and go get some real food. Like that's
okay. Now Reading Terminal Market, which is right across the Marriott, which I've stayed before, they have a macaroni and cheese in there at one of the stands that basically is macaroni and cheese spackle. I mean, it is that dense. It is made like with 75 cheeses, none of which are cheese whiz. And that's where I would recommend starting right there. You get this little container of macaroni and cheese, and you're going, well, I'm going to have something else. And by the time you're done, it's like you just ate a whole pizza.
Okay, we just wasted 5 minutes, and I think you and I may be the only ones who enjoyed that. So I wanted to start with something light, because we got to get into something that's not necessarily light right now. It's pretty heavy, and we're seeing it all throughout the NBA. We're also seeing it in the NFL, 75 COVID cases in the last 2 days. And so my question to you, Ira, I want to start with when we found out that Caleb Martin was going to miss that game the other night. And what are we talking last week now? And there seemed to be a level of frustration with Eric Spoelstra. And I believe what he said before the game was, I'm not in a place right now where I can rationally comment on this.
Right.
So where does the frustration lie within the Miami Heat? And what's your vibe as far as how they feel this needs to be handled moving forward, not just with Caleb, but with everybody?
Yeah, and I don't think it's just within the Heat, because Billy Donovan danced around it because he at the time had 7 players. Now he has 10 players who have been through the process. It's going to become a point where if there's not mandatory testing, which is not right now part of the agreement with the Players Association, it's up to the player to come forward and saying, I feel some symptoms, or honestly, Clay, not to come forward and say he's feeling some symptoms, because most of these have been asymptomatic. Some have been guys just feeling they had a head cold or something. Now, Joel Embiid had a much more severe case, and in that case, you do everything you need to protect your health. I'm not so sure there aren't other Caleb Martins out there, maybe even on the Heat, who are feeling a bit of stuffiness, who are feeling a bit of a head cold and are like, I mean, you know this, Clay. You've dealt with all the sports, hockey player especially. You push through this kind of stuff. Plenty of guys don't feel good when they play. And I mentioned this with Big O earlier in the week in our Accurate Pembroke Pines report. We'll mention it here in our Pallet Rock City Inside the Paint. Think about all the great flu games in all the sports. Michael Jordan laying in the locker room and clutching the ball in the NBA Finals and what he went through. The flu is contagious also. And if this latest variant is, and I was just reading the paper this morning, not more contagious, but apparently not as serious or causes as serious illness as Delta or the previous ones, I think at some point in all of our line of works, you're going to have to draw a line because you know what? The exact same symptoms that might keep a Heat player home from work might also be the person who is, and I'm not an alarmist here, who might be serving you at a restaurant because they need the income, who might be bagging your groceries at a local grocery store. So it's sort of a push-pull kind of thing. We've never quarantined people with the flu. We've never quarantined people with a bunch of other, contagious illnesses. We've asked them to be responsible. The NBA is in a tough spot right now. And my greater concern here, Clay, is this. The Heat are already missing Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler because of injuries. But they haven't had their latest round of this Omicron. They haven't had the COVID yet. So you might see the Heat without these guys in December and might still lose them come January or February. We've seen it before. Dante DiVincenzo finally gets over the ankle injury he suffered in the first round of the playoffs against the Heat last season. He was cleared to play, tested positive. He's out again. So this is going to be rolling through the league. You and I will definitely, on our Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint shows, be talking this year about whether this is a tainted season as Clay goes to black and white here. Although I bet we could still hear him. And I think we're going to have to deal with that, Clay, is will this become a tainted season or not? You're back.
I was checking the chat, and for some reason it must have knocked me out. And I don't know that it becomes a tainted season as long as you have everybody that you need to have for the playoffs. And you mentioned this during the crossover that what you don't want is a league that is robbed of its stars. And, because then you're talking about a situation where, look, if Giannis is out right now in December, okay, I mean, it's a bummer for people who were going to go to the Bucks games. It's people are bummed out that don't get to see him play, but it's not going to change the outcome of the Milwaukee Bucks season. I mean, let's be honest about this. The NBA is for moments like what we saw last night. The regular season is for moments like we saw last night. It's for really cool moments in games, guys dunking on each other, games coming down to the last second. Like, it's a blast, but we all know that all that matters as far as results go are the playoffs. So right now, it's tough to say, okay, we got to pull the plug because we're just trying to navigate through these regular season games. And yet, and this gets back to your other point, Ira, I feel like until there's some sort of set of protocols that makes this navigable, right? Like that if it's almost like you have to revisit the protocols. And I'm not even sure if that's just with the NBA. I think it may be society in general. There needs to be a pivot point because, as you said, CDC, I believe, said that right now with Omicron, it's runny noses and mild cough. And you don't want to immediately jump to the side where you're saying, okay, let's just push through this, because then you might get a few people who do get seriously ill. And then that you don't want one person to get hurt.
And you could bring it home also. And you remember this, Clay, NBA Finals 2 years ago, end of the season, Avery Bradley did not participate with the Lakers because his son had a respiratory illness.
Yes.
And he just felt, I cannot bring this home. So you always have to protect against the at-risk. But can you do it this way? Can you tell players you can play, but because of the higher exposure opportunities, please go right home. Please stay right home. Get in your car, come to the arena, go back home. That's how you can manage this. You can minimize and mitigate. When NBA players travel, they travel out of separate terminals at airports. They travel on separate planes, mostly Delta charters. They travel on separate buses, so you can segregate them from the general public. You can do that. Then it's on their own. There is a far greater chance that an NBA player passes along COVID at a restaurant, at a gathering, at Art Basel, at a holiday party, than they do during the course of an NBA game. When they're with people, or passes along serious illness with people in their age group who are not at high risk and don't run, sort of all those factors. So I think what you might be doing is telling NBA players games and home and travel, and that's it. I think that's how you can work around this as well.
Yeah, and I kind of putting a bow on this thing. I don't know that you can handle it a whole lot differently as far as who you're keeping out, what the testing procedures are, until and unless there is some sort of change in guidelines from the CDC. I mean, the NBA and every sports league has to take its cue from the people who know about this stuff, from the scientists. And yet, I think it's pretty clear right now that you're seeing in the NFL and in the NBA a situation where it may end up being worse than the last couple of years, not as far as guys getting seriously ill, but as far as the number of players who are out. 75 in 2 days in the NFL. I mean, it's coming in the NBA too, and it's not going to get worse before it gets better.
To get off the medical part, and let's go to the sports part that we're here for. Here's my concern. You're right. The playoffs are the only thing that matter. We pretend for the next few weeks, so please tune in every Wednesday, 9 a.m. here on Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint. But you know what? The regular season does impact the playoffs, and it impacts seeding. And you look at a team like Chicago that's having a great season. And if they get 4 or 5 extra losses and get shuffled out of home court in the first round, and I look at the Miami Heat and where they are, and of course they would rather get home court in the first round, maybe even get one of those top 2 seeds for home court in the second round. So this is impacting things. Last season, the Miami Heat finished 1 game out of having the number 4 seed in home court. Well, we know how it played out against Milwaukee. And I think it's safe to say, Clay, that if they played anyone but Milwaukee, they would have been in better shape. And if they were the home team in a first-round series, they might have even gotten to the second round. That's the problem. Now is impacting then. This isn't like in minor league baseball, you play a first-half schedule and you reset. Maybe the NBA needs to do that. Maybe they need to have a reset at a certain point for playoff points or something like that also. That's my concern, that a team like Chicago, or if it hits a team like the Heat, all of a sudden your seeding is impacted. So you could say, okay, here we are, finish line in April. We're at the playoffs, 1 through 6, no play-in, 7 through 10, you guys are in the play-in round. But how did you get there to those seedings? And was it fairly drawn? Last year, Clay, when the NBA did the schedule, they did it in 2 parts. They released the first half, and then they said, let's see how many games we miss, and we'll build our second half schedule. Well, you see, Chicago now has lost 2 games. The schedule's not built that way now. It's not easy to put games back in the second half of the schedule. For example, worst potential time beyond the Thanksgiving crush, everyone is saying, will be the Christmas season. Right after the Christmas holidays, the Heat go on a road trip to San Antonio, Houston. I got to memorize this because I got to travel it. San Antonio, Houston, Sacramento, Golden State, Portland, Phoenix. That's the Heat's last trip out west. If those games get canceled, there's not going to be another opportunity for the Heat to get to Portland or to get to Sacramento. So you just say, hey, if you lose them, you lose them, which I think they might do, and you're going to have staggered standings because all teams won't play 82. That's the difference. The NBA thought they were free and clear. So they did an entire season schedule. They booked events at arenas and things like that. I'm really curious if the NBA has to cancel a lot of games, how or even if they can reschedule them. And I think it's going to be hard enough just to do those 2 Bulls games, but at least they were Eastern Conference games. They weren't East-West games. This is a real problem right now for the league.
So Julius asked this question, is we're going to kind of bring this full circle now and impacting the games on the floor. Victor Oladipo has been traveling with the team now. You've seen him out working out. He looks good. I mean, it's not like you're expecting him to go out there and play 30 minutes.
He looks good drilling, right?
He looks good drilling. So I know you always say this, Ira, that they're just going to say, I have no update. But what's your vibe on, are we getting closer to where we can start to have Eric Spoelstra come out that one morning and give us the magic? Victor Oladipo is available tonight, or are we still a ways away and this is just something that we shouldn't read too much into?
Well, first of all, sound the aggregation alarm, because I think he's getting damn closer. And I think midseason still remains, that's about mid-January, maybe into early February, the time where it's been all along, to get him acclimated, to get him ready to go in limited doses to see what he can do. But Clay, there's no way you're dragging him in winter weather amid COVID to places like Cleveland and Philadelphia and then Orlando and Detroit if you don't think there's an end game possible here also. They don't need a mascot. They got Bernie back home. They could have put Bernie in the big Bernie suit and taken him with them if they wanted a mascot. They're moving towards something tangible. That could be an absolute game changer. Because, and we can get to this, after our break, I posit to you, I'm not sure there's another team outside of Damian Lillard or Ben Simmons is traded that can make as big an addition as the Heat could by adding Victor Oladipo for the second half of their season.
No, and I think the reason why I'm bringing it up now, first off, it was a great question by Julius. By the way, guys, if you're following us, make sure you hit the like button, or as O would say, smash the like button. That does us a big favor. Make sure you subscribe.
But I broke my computer last week smashing it, so I'm on this one now. I don't know know about that.
You weren't supposed to do it with the mallet, Ira. I think we talked about that. But if you're going to be missing players, or there is the threat of missing players, and it's not that Victor Oladipo comes in right now to a fully healthy and ready to rock Heat lineup where you've got Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo, and makes this enormous difference that's going to lift you from Eastern Conference finalist to NBA champion. What we're talking about right now is the difference between Victor Oladipo and Gabe Vincent, Victor Oladipo, and bringing somebody up on a two-way contract. I mean, that's what you're talking about at this point, is the level of gap of the guys that you're going to have to play versus Victor Oladipo. And again, Gabe Vincent has had some really nice stretches out there. But when you're talking about somebody as accomplished as Victor Oladipo coming back and being at least close to healthy, it's the type of addition that could not only help you in May and potentially June, but could really help you mitigate these murky days now where we're trying to get through this COVID
to put a
thing.
bow on this also before our break, think about this tonight, Clay Ferraro. The Heat are down to 11 players, but Tyler Herro has the quad bruise. If he can't play, they're down to 10. That means that Marcus Garrett on a two-way contract probably will have to play after playing for the Sioux Falls Skyforce just a week ago. Think about if Vic was here now and playable, and who knows, maybe we have a big story on our accurate Pembroke Pines report on Friday if he does wind up playing, but that's the difference, is these COVID-like moments. You probably will see Marcus Garrett tonight against the 76ers, or as Clay Ferraro says, who? I mean, and that's the difference because they're down to 10 or 11 players.
Yeah, and that's the gap. That's the difference. It's not a Victor Oladipo versus a Tyler Herro. It's a Victor Oladipo versus the guy who you're going to have to play significant minutes to because you're dealing with COVID and or injuries. And, hey, the Heat haven't even been hit yet. And so hopefully this is something where they are getting closer. And as you said, we get Eric Spoelstra to come up there with those magic words. Victor Oladipo is available tonight. All right, coming up next, we're going to look at the upcoming schedule with the Heat. We're going to get some more of your questions and just how do you navigate this? And can the Heat come out on the other side of this and get Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo back and somehow be better in the long term for it? That's coming up next right here on Inside the Paint. Welcome back here on Inside the Paint. Please, as always, drop your questions. We'll keep this thing interactive. Make sure you smash the like button. A lot to get to as we roll on. Ira, I want to start, though, with a tweet that you just put out. Over half the Heat roster right now, as of today, is now trade eligible. And we're hearing all of these rumors about Ben Simmons. And what I love is how Woj put something out there that, a Ben Simmons trade is gaining momentum, and they think that they're going to be able to get a top 25 player in exchange for him. Well, people need to understand, and you can probably attest to this, Woj and I believe Daryl Morey have a pretty good relationship. And you can look back over time, and whenever there was something with the Houston Rockets, Woj would have it. And it always feels, I always look at things that Woj puts out when Daryl Morey is involved with an extra layer of skepticism here. So I wonder if Ben Simmons is actually getting close to being dealt, or is it just that they're trying to build up some interest around the league and saying, hey, if you really want Ben Simmons, give us a call. But
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think more than anything is the 76ers either are deluded or patient with this whole thing, in believing that Ben Simmons still can fetch, because he's an all-star and one of the best perimeter defenders in the league, a top 10, top 15 player. Or they're simply going to wait him out until either he comes around, plays a little, and they can show him off a little more. I think what sort of Woj's tweet went to, whether there was some inside info or doing someone a favor with a quid pro quo kind of thing, is that the 76ers are showing they'll be patient. They're going to probably wind up playing half the season without Ben Simmons or Ben Simmons' replacement. And I think, Clay, you would agree. The Sixers would be a better team during the regular season with Ben Simmons, just another body. They've lost a bunch of guys to COVID and other injuries. And they would be a better team with a Ben Simmons replacement, whether it's a CJ McCollum or a Jalen Brown or someone like that. And yet they've been so patient that they've really hurt themselves into the seedings to the point where you wonder if home court is a lock like we all thought it was going into the season. So I think they very much do have big plans for what they can get for Ben Simmons. I don't think the market is there. I think he's viewed as distressed property. I mean, the last time we saw him playing, he was passing up an open layup because he wasn't even confident or afraid he was going to get fouled in that situation. I think he's a valuable player. I think they're going to get less than $1 on $1 I think they're not going to accept pennies on a dollar. I do not believe he is with the Philadelphia 76ers after the February 10th NBA trading deadline.
I can't see the Celtics giving up Jalen Brown for him, right? I mean, that's...
If they're treading water and they have two ball-dominant players in Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum, and I think Clay, even if, well, congratulations, you're now the GM of the Boston Celtics. If you had to pick one player as a centerpiece for your franchise between Jalen Brown and Jason Tatum, who would you pick?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if that's it, but I guess what I would say then, Ira, is can't you do better? I mean, if you're really going to trade Jalen Brown, and maybe my view of Ben Simmons as a player right now, not just as a player, but also his contract as an asset. I just think it's such a negative asset at this point. You're really going to give up somebody in Jalen Brown for somebody that I think you could probably get right now for expiring. You know what I mean? So to me, it's like...
Nah, Ben Simmons still has a high value because
with that contract?
He's a great playmaker. He's a great playmaker. He's probably a top 5 and maybe even top 3 perimeter defender. If you're Boston and you keep shaking things up and you go from Kemba Walker to Dennis Schroeder and from Evan Fournier and keep mixing up your mix and not getting results, it has to start at the top. And you have to make decisions, and it's more than bringing Al Horford back. So again, Clay, when do you pull the plug on it in Boston? Let's look at it this way. They pulled the plug with Danny Ainge, whether he resigned or not, say what you want. They pulled the plug on Brad Stevens, bumped him up to the front office. There were some questions there. So they've done the front office. They've done the coach. They've changed the roster to a degree. They've had all the great draft choices. Oh, I'm like Daryl Morey. I collect draft choices. Most of them have turned into almost nothing. You know, no offense to R.J. Hunter and the rest of them. So I think they might be desperate times for Boston. Because let me ask you this. Are the Boston Celtics, as presently constructed, a championship contender?
No. I just feel like if you're going to trade Jalen Brown, you could do better. I just feel like, you canvass the league and everybody wants a star. And I don't know that I would call Jalen Brown a star. I think he's an all-star caliber player for sure.
No, we always talk about all-star. We talk about all-NBA. He's an all-star because between players dropping out and everything, probably 30 players a year are named all-star, 28 players, as opposed to the 15 on the all-NBA roster. And Ben Simmons at his best is an all-NBA level player. At his best, at his confident, mental, and physical best. I'm not so sure that Jalen Brown is, so I think that would at least be intriguing. Again, you're trading within the division. You're trading within the conference. Maybe you don't want to go that way. Mm-hmm. Maybe one team doesn't want to benefit the other, and you wind up moving him out of conference instead. But you've got to do something. You've either got to get the real Ben Simmons back, or you've got to get his replacement. And honestly, really, you're a critical mass and have to do it sooner rather than later. Just not before tonight's game against the Heat.
Yeah, okay, so let's bring it full circle now. The reason why I even brought it up in the first place was you are hearing these names that are out there. Damian Lillard's name keeps popping up again, even though publicly he'll say, I'm committed to the organization.
And I think that's done, honestly. I think that's done for this reason. Once Damian Lillard comes out and says, I want to be a lifer in a city, I think that city wouldn't accept a trade anymore. I think he is the kind of, and I know Kobe came close to going to the Clippers or the Bulls, but he's sort of that player who said, I want to be identified with the franchise. If that came from the heart and that was candid and we can take that from him, from what he's saying, then I do think he's off the table. Then I do think it's sink or swim Blazers with him, no matter what happens, and you build around him. So I think the Damian Lillard thing, I think even more than Bradley Beal. For example, you might tell me, how about Ben Simmons for Bradley Beal or someone like that? I could see someone like that. Bradley Beal has not come out nearly as effusively as Damian Lillard has, that I'm a one franchise player. So that might be a better name as a starting point.
So bringing it back to the Heat, because you tweeted out this morning about all the players who were now trade eligible. I mean, it's pretty much everybody that they signed in the offseason. And, one day we can get into the weeds on how you can aggregate players who signed extensions, things like that. But strictly for this conversation, is this something that the Heat should be looking at? And I'm not talking about making a minor tweak, but just to throw this out there as an example, if you look on your bench and you say, okay, I know Duncan Robinson has been struggling, but hey, he'll get back at some point. Like we think he's going to get back to being close to the level that Duncan Robinson has been. But do we maybe look around? You hear the Nets are looking to shop Joe Harris. So all of a sudden, you're hearing about these guys whose names are being floated. Would you look to New Orleans? Would you look at New Orleans and call them about Brandon Ingram? I mean, are these the types of things that do you risk trading someone like a Duncan Robinson, who at this point his contract is also a devalued asset because he's been struggling? Do you look to go that route if something materializes, or do you try to keep up with what you're doing right now and try to get everybody back and hope that things click like they were earlier in the season?
Two things. First, we have to figure out and decide, are the Heat willing to be a luxury tax player? Because when you start jumbling all this money around and you're only $400,000 below the luxury tax threshold, there's a chance you're going over. So the Heat first have to decide that. If you go on the luxury tax, you don't get the $10 million reimbursement from the league, the overage from the other teams, Golden State, Brooklyn, that are over. That's the first decision before any other personnel moves, including even converting Caleb Martin's contract. But number two, attention aggregators, and this is not, again, about the person. This is about the contract. Duncan Robinson, to a degree, has the most tradable Heat contract for this reason. It's not a max contract, and it's not a minimum contract. It's a $15 million, starting now, an ascending contract that becomes a nice trade chip. And one thing I know about the Heat is they always think about the player, they think about the person, they think about the chemistry, but they also think about the possibilities regarding the cap. And I think when Duncan was given that deal, the Heat said to themselves, you know what? We got Jimmy in the stratosphere. We got Kyle in the stratosphere. We have Bam in the stratosphere. We still have Tyler, though, on a rookie scale contract, most the other way. Let's give ourselves a middle piece. Let's give ourselves a piece that if we have to start with 15 and add something to it, it's a lot easier than starting with 32 or starting with 4. So I think Duncan Robinson is the Heat's most tradable asset, whether he was making shots or whether he wasn't making shots just because of the salary. It's a cold world out there, as Clay Ferraro has often told me, and it really does come down to cap implications as much as anything. So yes, I think that Duncan Robinson right now, going into the February 10th NBA trading deadline, is the team's most tradable asset. Does it mean the Heat don't want him? It doesn't mean that, okay, aggregators, but it just means that his money would make a trade easier to facilitate.
Yeah, and so this is where it's different than the Tyler Herro situation for the last year, because the thing with Tyler was the Heat knew that there was another level that he could get to, or you could say get back to, get to playing like he was in the bubble. And look, the last couple of games he's not showing it. The quad is clearly an issue right now. I'm not making excuses for the guy, but he hadn't been himself the last couple of games. But if you had tried to trade Tyler Herro last offseason when he was coming off a really rough season where in and out of the lineup, you wouldn't have gotten nearly what you're looking to get. With Duncan Robinson right now, the contract, this is the difference, and this is the distinction that I'm trying to make, and kind of what you just said. The difference is the contract makes it to where even the fact that he's struggling lately, teams can look at that and say, okay, that contract is very movable to where we can bring him in and maybe he goes back to being the Duncan Robinson of 2020. Or even if he doesn't, that contract looks really pretty when you start working the trade machine and figuring out who you can bring in and potentially move him later.
And I want to go back, and again, certainly feel free to tap in on the chat. Just don't smash that. Don't break that. Don't break that button, or else we're dead here. You mentioned Victor Oladipo in the previous segment here on Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint. If Victor comes back and is Victor Oladipo, it's problematic in a good way.
Yeah.
But right now, Clay Ferraro, or as I like to call you, Andy Ellisberg, right now you have the contracts of Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry, Bam Adebayo, all already in that $30 million-ish range. Next October, even September, you can start in the offseason. Tyler Herro is eligible for the very type of extension, 5-year, $164 million or so that Bam Adebayo got. And the Heat still have the bird rights to Victor Oladipo. Kind of crazy. Vic went from a $20 million salary to against the cap like a 1.6 this year, but can go back up to $30 million because the Heat have his bird rights. So it's going to be interesting. If Tyler Herro gets back to what he was in November and Victor Oladipo gets back to what he was in Indiana, you can have a decision there. Can you afford to carry 5, or even counting Duncan Robinson's 5-year, $90 million deal, 6 of those deals on your books? So I think Victor Oladipo is going to impact the Heat on the court. He's going to impact their playoff chances, but he's also going to impact them in the salary cap, and they're going to have to make a decision. That's why it would be awesome if Victor Oladipo can come back, say, by January 10th, and you can get a month to look at him and then make a decision. Is Vic the guy, or is Tyler the guy? And if one isn't the guy, then you can go back, Clay, Andy, Ellisberg, Ferraro, go to your trade machine and sort of work a deal from there.
Yeah, and so when you're looking at the Heat roster as it's constructed, I don't see Victor Oladipo, if he comes in, replacing Duncan Robinson in the starting lineup. I think, if everybody's healthy and Vic comes back, he's coming off the bench as your seventh man along with Tyler Herro, right? And yet, I do think that if Victor Oladipo is healthy, Duncan Robinson isn't going to be in your closing lineup, unless you're talking about the offensive-defensive switches down the stretch where, hey, on offense, you're going to put Duncan out there because you need the gravity, you need the threat of his shooting. But when you're going up and down, last 5 minutes of a ball game, and there's not a timeout every single change, you're going to want Victor Oladipo on the floor, assuming he's healthy. You're going to want Tyler Herro on the floor. You're going to want Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry and Bam Adebayo. So if you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, can we make a move right now that helps our closing lineup, that helps the lineup that we're going to roll out there so it's not just, and what you brought up is a very good point, that you have to look at the cap sheet for next season and beyond if you do want to bring Vic back. But even strictly for this season, if you're looking at how this team is currently constructed, if a healthy Victor Oladipo comes back and you've got a lineup where you can basically switch 2 through 5, I'm not going to put Kyle Lowry on Brook Lopez anytime soon. But when you can switch all these guys, do you really want to have that much money committed to someone who isn't necessarily going to be closing games for you?
And here's the thing. I actually think I caught you there for a second, so I'm going to put this back on you. Let's assume our closing lineup includes PJ Tucker, who's been awesome lately.
And Tucker, yeah.
And Bam Adebayo. If that's the case, and I posit to you that my 3 two-way wings are going to be Victor Oladipo, Jimmy Butler, and Kyle Lowry, is Tyler Herro suddenly valued as much? Like, Clay, when you cover football and you talk to me about a third down back, yes, he gets you what you want. He can catch passes out of the backfield. He could open up the field for you, but he's not an every down back. Mm-hmm. I think that he'd have to decide that also about Tyler Herro. Is he an every down guard when it comes to closing playoff lineups, or if Victor Oladipo is anything like Indiana Victor Oladipo, is that the better way to go? Look, these are good decisions they're going to have. The problem is, and this will get more interesting on our weekly Inside the Paint brought to you by Pallet Rack City, as far as when we get to the trading deadline, what are you going to do for the future? Do you live in the moment and just say, hey, this season we'll worry about next season in the offseason? Or do you say to yourself, we have some intriguing parts here. We're close to the luxury tax. How are we going to handle it? I think February 10th is going to be really interesting for the Heat because I'm not sure many teams have as many moving parts as the Miami Heat do.
And to answer your question, because I think it's a good one, I think it'll be matchup specific. And, if you're going up against a team like Brooklyn, you're going to want to have your best defensive lineup out there where you're going to be able to switch everybody. And then in that case, maybe it doesn't make quite as much sense to have Tyler Herro on the floor, get Victor Oladipo out there, and, assuming that Kyrie Irving is back.
Right, but if you have a Joe Harris out there, then maybe you can, I don't want to say hide Tyler Herro. I don't want to mean Joe Harris, but you might have that kind of matchup. But if they're just going to go with Kyrie and Harden and Durant as their wings, if they have enough bigs, then you get in trouble there. So it is interesting thinking, and it's crazy, Clay. At a time we're talking when the Heat have no bodies, we also know when the Heat are fully whole and healthy, which they've not been since Victor had his quadricep surgery, all of a sudden it's like, who don't you play? And man, would it be nice to get back to those days.
All right, a lot more coming up next right here on Inside the Paint. We're going to look at the upcoming schedule, and is a run coming? Is this team ready to go on a little bit of a spurt? We'll get to that and more coming up next right here on Pallet Rack City, Inside the Paint. Welcome back right here on Inside the Paint. Ira Winderman in Philly, getting set to go out and hang out at Pat's and Gino's and eat as much Cheese Whiz as his stomach can take. And so, Ira, that brings us to the upcoming schedule, and you've got the Philadelphia 76ers coming up tonight. And, obviously, this is a tough one. When you look at the upcoming stretch, it's a team that, just beat Golden State the other night. It's a team that has similar aspirations as you do long-term, even though you've got the Ben Simmons question hanging over your head. How do you go out with a shorthanded lineup tonight? How do you approach this game tonight against Philadelphia? Who do you target? Who do you go after? And how do you find a way to just get the job done in this one?
I think more than anything, and it's what I sent you in our text preparing for the show, you sort of get yourself ready for what's to follow. And I think from the get-go when this trip started, just to review to people, it opened Monday with a loss in Cleveland, tonight here in Philadelphia, Friday in Orlando, Sunday in Detroit. And you say to yourself, get a split and get the hell off the road. So I think the priority, and Eric Spoelstra will never say this, including when I head over to Wells Fargo Center in about half an hour for shoot-around, he's not going to blow off tonight's game. But Philly's the better team. And if they have Joel Embiid, well, God help Dwayne Dedmon, but God bless him also. And maybe UD gets out there and sort of sets the rules. You want to get the game in Orlando, and you want to get the game in Detroit. And then you want to come home with a favorable schedule that includes Indiana and then Detroit and Orlando again. And then you have a road trip where you're going to go out and play San Antonio and Houston and Sacramento to start the trip. Those are your gettable games, whether Jimmy is back, whether Bam is back, whether Caleb Martin is back. So I think you give yourself a puncher's chance going in. You try to stay competitive like you did in the first half against Cleveland. But I think at some point, which runs contrary to everything the Heat say, you might have to let go of the rope because you can't afford another late game Tyler Herro injury or what we saw just around halftime in Cleveland on Monday. You better be ready to take care of Orlando. Tonight's not going to be a bad loss. When I talked to Big O on Friday morning before the Magic game in our accurate Pembroke Pines report, I'm not going to be talking to him about, oh, the Heat lost in Philly, the world's coming to an end, they lost 2 in a row. I'm going to be, so far everything's copacetic and we're fine. But next week when I talk to you, Clay, if they've lost to Orlando or Detroit or that home game where they get back home against Indiana, I got choked up there. Then I'm going to be choked up a little bit because those are the ones that you can't let get away. Right now, I've said this and I know it's redundant, even keel, just stay even while everyone's out, ride the wave without Jimmy and without Bam, and then make up ground when you're whole and at home again.
Yeah, and so it's just navigate. And to your point, it's the thing that we've seen Heat teams do in the past that's bitten them at the end of the season is they lose those games that you should not lose. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, with this team, when they're healthy, and I'm not talking about when you're shorthanded and something, the loss at Indiana when you were missing Kyle earlier in the year, that probably falls in that category. I'm not going to put the loss against Cleveland at home when you just found out that Bam was going to be out. That was kind of a gut punch. Don't lose those games. Because how often do we look back at the end of the season, and I can tell you specifically it was games against the Knicks, it was games against the Magic. I mean, you can look back and say, that game cost this team home court advantage. And you're not going to say that about a game against Philly in November or in December when you're missing Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler and Tyler Herro may be out tonight. You are going to say that about any loss against Orlando. You are going to say that about a home game against Indiana. You are going to say that about any game against Detroit. I do think this team has the mindset and the makeup to understand that. And yet at the same time, you got to go out there and get it done. So I'm with you, Ira. It's not that you're punting on tonight. You're going to go out there, you're going to give it your best shot. And you're hoping that maybe something crazy happens, like when you saw what Caleb Martin did against the Bucks. And yet at the same time, you have to be realistic about it and say, it's not worth pushing Tyler Herro through, for example. It's not worth pushing him through whatever it is that he's fighting with that quad and potentially putting him in a situation where you don't have him for one of those games when you may otherwise have him.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Clay. At the beginning of the season, I spoke to you and Big O about you can't lose to Detroit. You can't lose to Orlando. You can't lose to Cleveland. Cleveland's good. You lost to them twice. I have no issue. But that means other teams in the East aren't as good. Maybe like the Knicks or Indiana, teams I thought would be good. So maybe when the Heat come off this 4-game trip, I mentioned that game against the Pacers, you can't lose again to the Indiana Pacers. You can't lose that season series. You're 1-1 right now against them. So things do change. Cleveland's really good. And they know who they are and they know what they are. And for everyone who said you can't play with a bunch of bigs, I think J.B. Bickerstaff was really good when we spoke to him before that game on Monday, and he said, you can't play with a lot of bigs if they can't run. Our guys can run. Jared Allen can run. Larry Markkinen can run. Evan Mobley can run. That's the difference. They've sort of beat the system there. So, yes, you might have said earlier in the year, how do you lose to Cleveland? I'm fine. Well, I'm not fine with that. I'd rather get a victory. I understand and appreciate that. You made up with it by beating Chicago, by beating Milwaukee. So, puncher's chance tonight. Joel Embiid is questionable. He didn't play the previous game. Seth Curry is questionable. That certainly would help a lot. So I think you wait and deal to see who's out there with Philly. Again, if we're talking 2-2 road trip, no, I never wanted the Heat to be mediocre, but with their injuries, I think 2-2 would be fine.
Yeah, so looking at, we mentioned the upcoming schedule and who you're going to have to play. I think especially in a game like tonight, let's assume Tyler Herro doesn't play. You're going to need more contribution. You're going to need guys to step up. And how about somebody like Mackenzie Okpala? How about somebody like an Omer Yurtseven, and obviously not playing the same position, but it's going to need to come from somewhere.
It'll have to be. I mean, without Tyler Herro, you're probably starting the same lineup as Cleveland. So you're going to wind up starting Dwayne Dedmon, PJ Tucker, Duncan Robinson, Gabe Vincent, and Kyle Lowry. So then you go, who the hell's on the bench? And I guess your first off the bench is, I guess by default, Max Strus. Your second probably is KZ Okpala. And your third probably is you're going to wind up with Omer Yurtseven. And the only other two available players, if Tyler doesn't play, are going to be Udonis Haslem and are going to be Marcus Garrett. So, yeah, you're going to have to get a KZ game out of this also. I just posted a story about that at sunsentinel.com, as a matter of fact, where Eric Spoelstra spoke about it and PJ Tucker spoke about it. Hey, if these guys ever wanted to learn under fire, if they ever wanted to play meaningful moments, it might not have been the Heat game plan to get minutes for KZ Okpala and Omer Yurtseven, but they're getting meaningful moments. And you know what? Maybe we learn more about them now than for all those countless garbage time minutes they were playing earlier in the season.
And Man of 1,005 Holds brings up a good point. He said, the good thing, he's talking about the COVID protocols and how maybe you look at, do you ultimately have to reschedule games? He said forfeit. I don't know if that would happen, but if you just cancel games, whatever.
You can't forfeit. You can't penalize someone for getting COVID.
Right.
This is not like someone leaving the bubble and getting chicken wings and then coming back or something like that. These are regular people going through everyday life. For the most part, these guys are responsible. And I know there have been some exceptions, and we've seen some people at large indoor public gatherings unmasked, but you can't blame people. It's like firing someone from calling in sick from work. No, forfeit's not a part of this unless you can see gross negligence from those involved.
And if you were to do that, then you're talking about maybe you decentivize people from saying when they have symptoms. I mean, they might just pretend like they're fine.
Good point.
So, but his point, and not to go too far off track, was you've got an Eastern Conference where you've got a bunch of teams jumbled together. And he said maybe that benefits the Heat because, it's okay. You may lose one game. The flip side of that is, not necessarily with a game like tonight, but it means that you absolutely more than ever have to take care of the Orlandos of the world. You have to take care of the Indianas of the world. You can't lose these games because we saw it last year. I mean, losing one of these games against a team that is horrendous can be the difference between you being the 3 seed at home or the 6 seed on the road. And who knows, maybe it'll be so jumbled, it could be the difference between you having a 4 seed in at home or playing in the play-in round. I mean, more than ever, you have to make sure that you take care of these teams, Ira. So your take on that and the jumbled Eastern Conference and how you can where do you find the edge here if you're the Heat? How do you find a way to get through all of this, given what you've been through in the past?
Well, here's the problem. I've said with Bam out and with Jimmy out that the Heat still have 2 quality elite players in Tyler Herro and Kyle Lowry. Tyler Herro's out. I don't know if you're much better than Orlando. I don't know if you're much better than Detroit. So I think you're going to reach a point of attrition where there's only one way around it, and that's Duncan a go-go. And Duncan Robinson just has to hit threes like crazy and become an offensive force. He's actually been better and doing a good job on the 2-point shots recently, playing more in attack mode. But I think the point you made before was a really good point. They need Caleb Martin 2.0 from someone else. Caleb Martin came out of nowhere last week to spark them against the Bucks. Whether it's a KZ Okpala, whether it's Dwayne Dedmon like he was against the Bulls with a 20-point game and now playing Nikola Vucevic, that's what they're going to need. Eric Spoelstra is very good at game planning. The good thing now, Clay, there are no back-to-backs. They've had a day to prepare for Philly. They'll have a day to prepare for Orlando. They'll have a day to prepare for Detroit. And I think if you put Eric Spoelstra in the lab with ample time, he'll come up with a game plan. So I'd almost put Spoelstra as the number 2 guy behind Kyle Lowry now when it comes to the Heat finding a way. But you know what? Eventually attrition gets you. I said this about Saturday's game against Chicago, that the 5 best players out there, when you looked at it, the Heat had Herro and that the Heat had Kyle Lowry playing, but Chicago had Lonzo Ball, they had Nikola Vucevic, and they had Zach LaVine. And when you saw what happened with Zach LaVine, he almost single-handedly carried them in that game. So I think you're going to reach a point, Clay, is that where if you don't have 2 of the 5 best players out there, and it's all on Kyle Lowry. Look, no one is counting on a 35-year-old to be an every-game player. And yes, what PJ Tucker did at 36 on Monday was remarkable and almost was a damn shame to waste that effort in a loss.
I agree.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're going to have to game plan it. You're going to have to play within structure, and you sure as hell are going to have to cut down on the stupid and mindless turnovers that you had in the loss in Cleveland on Monday.
And that's what's grinding on them right now. It's not, you can take a loss. You can take a loss against a Cleveland team that, the way they're constructed and the way they're playing, you tip your cap if your cap if it's because they're playing so much better than you. But yeah, you gotta get rid of that. So you got to play clean ball. And again, we understand that tonight's going to be an uphill battle. But moving forward after that, you can't afford to have empty possessions against teams as bad as Orlando, and you can't give them hope. I want to go back to what you said about Duncan Robinson, though, because it felt like for the last 2 years now, maybe even more than that, first offensive possession every game, it's let's find a way to get Duncan Robinson free for a three. And then that'll kind of set the tone for the rest of the game. Then this year, those haven't necessarily been falling. And what I wonder is, you are, like you said, you're seeing Duncan drive a little bit more. You're seeing him with some of the mid-range stuff, which, hey, man, if that's on the scouting report now, then it opens up everything else for him.
Sure.
Do you think this is kind of like when you've got a baseball player who's, in an 0 for 21 streak, and you ask him to just lay down a bunt? Something like that, where you're trying to get a guy to see the ball go in the basket, and then maybe Duncan isn't thinking about this as much every time he lines up a three-pointer because he just made a layup. Yeah,
absolutely, and they've done that, and they've done a good job about it. And probably, it's interesting, Clay, a week or 2 weeks ago, if you would have told me Miami Heat biggest concerns, I would have had Duncan Robinson at the top of that list. I do not have him at the top of that list anymore. He's come around with enough that you can see signs of, that Duncan Robinson. So I think you move to something else. Right now, I'm worried about COVID. Right now, I'm worried about injuries and when guys are going to get back. Right now, I'm worried about too much wear on my 36-year-old starting power forward and my 35-year-old starting point guard. And I know you could say that Kyle Lowry took a ton of time off last year. And except for the NBA playoffs, when PJ Tucker was in Houston, he wasn't really playing, so he got some time off. But you know what? You're going to have to find rest for them. Optimally, the rest comes when Jimmy Butler is back, when Bam Adebayo is back, for those two guys right there, when Caleb comes back, maybe when Victor comes back. But I do wonder a little if you're going to see high totals. That's why it was good to see, even though he had 14 assists, could have gone for the Heat record, Kyle Lowry didn't play in the fourth quarter against Chicago. And even Monday, when Eric Spoelstra realized, hey, this might not be our night, he was mindful of the minutes. This might be another mindful of the minutes night tonight against Philly. So if you wait to turn on the Heat game, it's a 7 o'clock start tonight, and you turn it on late, you might sit there in the fourth quarter and going, Marcus Garrett, is he on our team? And you might see a little more of him than maybe you anticipated.
And going back to the beginning of the season, and I said this, and I think you would agree, that the biggest concern with this team is what you just mentioned. It's making sure these guys are healthy for when it matters. And that doesn't just mean that, they don't have a torn ACL come May. It's, you don't have that wear and tear. You want to steal breaks for these guys. You want to steal days off. And this is not to be alarmist. You were hoping that your younger players, your young all-star in Bam Adebayo, would be healthy enough to kind of shoulder the load at times. And you were kind of counting on him being the one many of these times when you were going to hope to get those guys a rest day to be the one to show. Well, he's hurt. And you were hoping to steal some off days for Jimmy Butler. Well, now they've been forced upon him to where he may have to be playing through stuff later on in the season when you're trying to steal those rest days potentially for Kyle Lowry. So the challenge for Eric Spoelstra moving forward, and this is not just in the immediate future, but long-term, and we'll talk about this week after week, it's how do you maintain a competitive team that goes out there and goes for top 3 seed in the Eastern Conference as the season rolls on, while also making sure that when you get there, when you play the games that actually matter, your guys don't have nicks and knacks and tendinitis.
And you know what, Clay? And so what I do is the week Bam Adebayo comes back, I tell PJ, take the week off. Don't go to Cabo because of COVID, but take the week off. And when Jimmy comes back, I tell Kyle, take the week off. And now people might say, well, what about chemistry? Fine. In mid-February, late February, March, then you bring it all back together after everyone's rested, after everyone's recovered, after there's this new Pfizer pill that is magic and you stay on the court anyway, and you go from there. We're still taking the long view. The Heat are still well-positioned, 4 or 5 in the Eastern Conference, not in that playoff play-in level that we have to worry about yet. So you still preserve your roster. It's a real tightrope. It's a real high-wire act for Eric Spoelstra right now. but that's how the NBA season has been. Usually it's that way with injuries. Now you have COVID. Now you have older players. This is the roster they chose. They chose a roster with a bunch of guys in their early to mid-30s, and so there are consequences there also. So it really is a minefield. It's going to be interesting to use every cliche possible about how Eric Spoelstra sort of navigates that. It really is on him.
They've got to take it one day at a time. They've got enough. They've got to put one foot in front of the other. Pick out all the cliches.
Perfect. Hey, guys, on the show.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Some great talk today. Some great questions. Great interaction. We appreciate it. The Big O Show rolls on next. Thanks for hanging out here on Pallet Rack City Inside the Paint.